In 1913, a woman in St. Louis sat down at a Ouija board. She wasn't a scholar. She wasn't a mystic. She was a housewife. And the board spelled out 7 words. Many moons ago I lived. Again I come. What followed those 7 words was 4 million more. Novels. Poems. Plays. Praised by real critics. Published by real publishers. Placed in anthologies alongside some of the most celebrated writers of the 20th century. The woman said she didn't write any of it. And the part that stays with me, the part one keep turning over, is that nobody has ever been able to prove she did. Pearl Curran was born in 1883 into an America that had already decided what she was. A woman. A wife. A keeper of a house on a quiet street in Missouri. She had a basic education. No university. No literary training. No particular ambition that anyone around her ever noticed or thought to ask about. She played piano. She kept house. She smiled when she was supposed to. And the world moved around her the way it always moves around women it has already categorized, without looking twice. Now, you need to understand what America felt like in 1913. This was a country still raw from the Civil War. Still processing a grief so large it had no proper name. And into that silence something had quietly settled, spiritualism. The belief that the dead were not entirely gone. That the distance between this world and whatever came next was thinner than we assumed. This wasn't a fringe belief. William James, the father of American psychology, co-founded the American Society for Psychical Research. Seances were held in the homes of scientists, doctors, university professors. The Ouija board was sold in toy shops. Pearl had one. For months she sat with it and got nothing. Vague letters. Nonsense. The nothing that most people get. Until July 8, 1913. Nobody recorded what the evening felt like. Whether it was warm. Whether the windows were open. Whether Pearl felt anything different before it started. What we know is that the planchette began to move, clearly, deliberately, and it spelled. Many moons ago I lived. Again I come. Patience worth my name. Wait, I would speak with thee. If thou shalt live, then so shall I. Pearl asked who she was. A woman. Born in Dorsetshire, England, in the 17th century. A Puritan who had crossed the Atlantic to the New World and been killed in a raid on her settlement. She had never married. Never been known. She had lived in the absolute margins of history and left no mark on it whatsoever. 300 years of silence. And now this. Here's the thing about Patience Worth that surprises people when they first encounter her. She wasn't vague. She wasn't gentle or wispy the way you'd expect a ghost to be. She was sharp. Impatient. Funny. She had opinions and she delivered them with a wit that made the people in the room laugh out loud. She felt specific. Uncomfortably, undeniably specific. Like a person. Like someone who had been waiting a long time and was quietly relieved that the wait was finally over. She began to write. Not fragments. Not short messages. The way a dam breaks, completely, all at once. First, letter by letter, Pearl reading aloud while a stenographer took it down. But as months became years, the board became unnecessary. Pearl would simply sit, and the words would come, fully formed, continuous, sometimes while holding simultaneous conversations with others in the room. As if whatever was producing the words ran on a current entirely separate from her conscious mind. At her peak, Patience Worth was producing 1,500 words an hour. Professional writers, trained, educated, experienced, often produce 1,000 in a full working day. Pearl Curran was producing 1,560 minutes. In archaic syntax. In a voice that wasn't hers. Without notes, without drafts, without stopping to think. What those words built, The Sorry Tale, a 644-page novel set at the time of Christ that scholars called theologically sophisticated and critics compared to William Blake. Hope Trueblood, a Victorian novel so convincing that British readers assumed an Englishwoman wrote it. Telka, a medieval poem in archaic Anglo-Saxon vocabulary, words dead for centuries. Linguists examined it for mistakes and anachronisms. They couldn't find one. The Joint Committee of Literary Arts of New York commended Patience Worth as an exemplary writer. She appeared in anthologies alongside Edna St. Vincent Millay. These were not credulous people. These were critics, editors, scholars, professionals whose entire job was detecting mediocrity and saying so plainly. And they were not saying that. So, the explanation? I've looked for it. I've genuinely looked. The simplest answer: Pearl was a fraud. She wrote it herself and invented Patience Worth as a costume, a gimmick, a way in. But to believe that, you have to believe that Pearl Curran, a woman with no literary education and no known access to the historical archives this work would have required, secretly possessed the ability to produce 600-page novels in authentic archaic language at 1,500 words an hour, while holding conversations with people in the room, sustained without a single slip for over 2 decades, and then gave all the credit away to a ghost. The second answer feels more honest. Pearl had a dissociative condition. Some vast, suppressed region of her mind constructed an entire separate person to speak through, a hidden genius that could only create from behind a mask. This is the explanation I find most plausible. And it is still one of the most extraordinary things I've ever sat with, that a mind of that scale existed inside a woman the world had completely looked past. But every explanation, eventually, hits the same wall. There are no records of any person named Patience Worth ever having existed. Not in Dorsetshire. Not in colonial New England. Not in any parish register, ship manifest, court document, or census. Pearl never claimed to have researched this. She had no access to the archives where such a search would even begin. She just knew. Or something knew through her. The fraud theory can't account for it. The dissociation theory can't account for it. Every framework I've tried bends and then breaks against that single fact. Where it came from, I genuinely can't tell you. There's a part of this story that tends to get skipped over. But I don't want to skip it. Think about Pearl's world for a moment. 1913. A woman in Missouri. No degree. No platform. No path to being heard. If Pearl had walked into a publisher's office and placed a manuscript on the desk and said, "I wrote this," we know what would have happened. We know, because it happened to women constantly. The door, politely or impolitely, closed. But a humble housewife, a vessel, making no claim of her own talent, simply transcribing what came through her, that was a different conversation entirely. The séance was one of the only spaces in early 20th century life where a woman's voice made people go quiet and lean forward. Where she wasn't dismissed before she finished her sentence. Whether Pearl chose the mask of Patience Worth consciously, or whether it was chosen for her by something she couldn't name or control. She found the one door that was open, and she walked through it. And she wrote things that outlasted nearly every person who would have turned her away at any other door. By the 1930s the sessions had slowed. The words came less urgently. Pearl had moved to Los Angeles. The world had moved on to other anxieties. One afternoon she turned to a close friend and said, without particular drama, "Oh Dotsy, Patience has just shown me the end of the road." She wasn't ill. There was no warning. No diagnosis. Nothing that would have made the words feel like anything other than an odd thing to say on an ordinary afternoon. Shortly after, Pearl Curran developed pneumonia. On December 3, 1937, she died. Patience Worth was never heard from again. Pearl Curran's books are public domain. You can read them tonight. Hold a 600-page novel that flowed through a St. Louis housewife and decide for yourself what you're holding. Everyone who has ever tried to close this case, the scholars, the skeptics, the linguists, the critics, none of them have. What's harder to dismiss is this. Pearl Curran knew when the words were stopping before her body did. As if whatever had been using her finally said what it came to say. Her name was Pearl Curran. The world forgot her. But the words are still there. 4 million of them. Waiting.